Aloha and welcome to Koa Studio. In this video, I'm going to be recreating a piece from the Micronesian islands of Kiribati. This is a shark tooth sword. Now this style of piece was more of a ceremonial piece, but I'm going to be recreating it for a testing purpose. Now I'm not going to be testing it, but the client that requested it is going to be testing it for a production that they're making. So I'm super excited to work on this piece. Funny enough, I haven't actually created this sword before. I've made similar weapons that have a similar design from the Hawaiian Islands of Polynesia, but I actually have not made this specific design before, which is kind of exciting. I've seen it a lot of times. I've always wanted to make it. I just never quite had the opportunity. And so the first step that I have is going to be sketching out the design of this. After some rough measurements taken from both the archive image as well as just some basic measuring from the photo, I was able to figure out that it's about a third. The handle is about a third the size of the total piece, and the entire piece that was in display was about 22 inches, and I made mine 24, so it's a little bit longer. Now this is a single-handed sword, and I'm doing a little bit of my design style in the sword. So I have a diamond shape at the end of the handle. That is a little bit more of a Hawaiian style, less from the Micronesian islands, but I wanted to add my own concepts to the piece. When contacted by the client, they allowed me to use my own creative freedom. They just wanted the piece done in a general style, and this was one of these styles that they picked. Now the first step before I can start working on this is I'm needing to make center lines across both the edge and both faces. The reason for this is it has a large taper. So the image, if you look on the left of the screen, you can see how that ridge line goes all the way from the handle all the way to the tip. And so I'm not going to do an exact ridge like that. Rather, I'm going to do a convex taper from all edges that's going to come up to the center ridge. And so wanting to keep track of that center ridge, I made sure and drew a center line on both sides. And then I'm just slowly working my way down the piece. Now I have to be careful with the angle grinder. I'm using a 36 grit angle grinder. And if I'm too aggressive with it, if I'm too fast, I can gouge it to the point where I could actually just ruin the piece entirely. And this is made out of Hawaiian Koawood, which is a little bit expensive. And so if I gouge the piece, I'll likely have to start all over again on an entirely new piece of Koawood, which is definitely something I want to avoid. So you can see from the different angles here, I'm just trying to keep that ridge line. Now with the angle grinder, I'm only going to be shaping it so far. I can't shape it entirely with the angle grinder because it's too aggressive. I'll be switching to a disc sander and continuing to shape using that. But I can get a lot of the rough design and rough shape with the angle grinder, removing a lot of material. I am going to be testing weight, making sure the balance feels good and that it feels good in my hand. I was a little bit concerned that the handle might be a little bit too small, but it was fitting really nice and cleanly, at least with my hand shape. With the client's hand, I don't know if they have a larger hand or smaller hand than mine, so there is a slight risk there, but that's just something that we'll have to deal with as we go along. I did notice as I was working on the piece though, that it had a little bit of pitting here and there, probably from either dry rot or some bugs a long time ago. And so I'm filling those tiny little pits and sections with sawdust from this piece, and then using some CA glue, a really thin CA glue, which is just going to soak into the wood and lock in those sawdust particles. And I'm doing that to fill it and get it stabilized. This way, when I go to sand, those sections don't sand out faster. With the sections that are rotted or pitted or have a little bit of dry rot, they're really soft. And so it can be very difficult to get a nice clean sand across the entire thing because they're going to want to sand quicker. So by filling it with sandpaper, it'll help alleviate that. Now sanding this piece, I'm starting with 120 grit. Because it's a fairly simple design, I was largely under the impression that it would be fast and not take very many sanding discs. I was absolutely wrong. And I ended up using my entire bag of sanding discs, which was unfortunate. But I was able to get it down and ready for the next stage. So at 220 grit, I can start doing a little bit more shaping and contouring. At the 120 grit, the rough sandpaper really just gets out those deep scratches that the angle grinder left. At the 220 grit, I can start to actually hone in on all of those angles and those lines. I've had a lot of people ask me how I get crisp lines, and it's just taking my time and sanding up to the line as I move up from 120 to 220 to 320 or even higher in the sanding grit. But for this piece, I'm only going to be taking it up to 320 grit. I am being very careful though, because I want those lines to be nice and clean and crisp. On the handle, I am going to put a wrap, so you're not going to see most of the handle, but just because you don't see it doesn't mean that I want to leave it unfinished. Now, there was an enormous amount of sanding, and I thought, hey, it would be kind of fun if you guys followed along with me and watching all of this boring sanding. But I wanted to preserve all of the fun for me, so you don't get any of the fun, and because of that, we're just going to skip all of the sanding and move on to the next step. Now that I have this piece sanded down to 320 grit, I can go ahead and cut in the grooves. The grooves of this, I'm going to use this tungsten carbide bit, and I'm going to be pulling it across the blade. Now it's going to have shark teeth on both sides of this blade. I'm going to be using bull shark teeth for that. But the reason why I pull it across is it actually makes it a lot easier to cut a straight line. I'm sure there's a lot of better ways to do this, but this is just how I learned. And I've gotten to the point now where I can cut a decently straight line, and so I don't really worry too much about finding an alternate method. A router table or something else like that would probably work, but it is what it is. Once I have the grooves cut in and I have it sanded, I can go ahead and set the teeth. Now the primary mechanical hold for the teeth is going to be lashing, but just like the majority of my pieces, I am going to set them in an epoxy mixed with wood shavings. And I do that to help stabilize them, or more rather to keep them in place while I drill the holes and lash the teeth together. And so I went ahead and I glued both the front and the back side. You're just going to have to believe me on the second half that I glued them in, or it was magic, one of the two. For the teeth, I'm using a diamond tipped bit, and this is, I think, an 1/8 inch bit if I remember correctly. I just go through and I tap a hole in each one of them. I am trying to tap them lower in the teeth, so closer towards the root of the tooth rather than in the enamel. But depending on the size of the tooth and how deep it is seated in the wood, you can only do so much there. But I do that because it helps maintain rigidity and strength of the tooth, not to damage the enamel. The next step here is to mark and cut in the holes that I'm going to lash the teeth to in the piece. I'm just using a piece of wood here as a template. That way the holes have all the same spacing from the edge. And then the holes are placed in between each tooth. And so there's no measurement on the gapping, it's just however wide the tooth is. And then I use this nail here to start my hole. And I do that so that the drill bit, when I go to drill this, doesn't walk on me. If I had a drill press, I may or may not have to do that, but it'd probably still be beneficial. But, you know, I don't have a drill press. So these are all drilled by hand, but utilizing that nail to start that hole for me helps keep it really straight and preventing the bit from walking, and makes it a lot easier. I went ahead and sanded that. Again, I didn't show you that because that's fun stuff, and you don't get to watch the fun stuff. You get to watch the boring stuff, like oiling this piece. I'm just joking. This is actually my favorite part of the entire build. I love oiling the Koawood. I use tongue oil. It's just the tongue oil doesn't really have a color to it. It'll darken the wood a little bit, but it does a really good job of just bringing out the natural grain of the wood. And with Koawood, it has a natural sheen, and a lot of the Koawood that I utilize also has a curl to it, and so it just turns out absolutely gorgeous. I love the way that it looks. It's like a warm golden color. Sometimes it even looks like flame. In this case, it's like a really tight micro curl, and then it just has a lot of figure and different characteristics to the piece. And so the the contrast on it was just awesome. I love the way that was looking. I did forget a step though. So I had originally planned on putting in a abalone pearl inset into the handle of the piece. Normally I would do that before I oil it, but I forgot, obviously. So what I'm doing here is I just outlined it with a very sharp pencil, so I get a nice clean outline, and I'm using a router bit with my Dremel, so I'm being just very careful and cutting this in because I'm freehanding it. So pretty much what I did is I cut in the center, and then I slowly worked out the outer edge to come up to that line, and just went back and forth between the inset and cutting in the inset so that it would be a nice tight fit. And then I filled it with epoxy filled with wood shavings, and the point of that is because it wasn't a perfect inset, and that epoxy will help fill those gaps, and the wood shavings will hide or help hide that gap so that it's not as present. And then I'm going to follow that same process on the other side. I did match so that if you look at the piece from the top or bottom, those insets are in the relatively same place from front to back. And that just helps keep a little bit of symmetry. It doesn't have to be perfect because these insets aren't perfect to each other. And so the next step is just sanding that in, cleaning up that inset, and then doing a final small oil on the handle. I am going to let that sit for just a little bit, not a full amount of time because I don't really need to. I let it sit for about an hour, and now I'm coming back and I'm going to be lashing in the teeth. Lashing in the teeth takes quite a long time. It can be a hassle. I do a triangle lash, a knee-hole pattern. So the triangle pattern is a shark teeth pattern. I like that pattern for a lot of reasons. It's easy to do, it looks nice, and it has a really strong hold with the teeth. But it still takes a long time, especially with the number of teeth that I had here. And so I got really, I hate to say bored, but I really didn't want to lash the second half. So instead of lashing the second half, I just decided to do a little bit of magic and plop that string right on there. See, that's the nice part about making a YouTube video, is I don't actually have to do the work. I just pretend like I do the work, and voila, it's done. I did do the work though. But so far it's turning out pretty awesome. I love the way that the piece is turning out. So the last step here before I put on my final finishing coats is I need to lash the handle. Now the wrap on the handle is not for structural support, it's purely for grip, so it's easier to hold. And the reason why I had a loop that's going underneath the wrap is that wrap is going to go all the way around, and that loop's going to be left over, and I'll be able to tie a knot and pull that through, and that'll lock everything into place. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but here in a minute you'll see that and it'll make a little bit more sense, or it won't make any sense at all and you'll just be confused, which is unfortunate, but I'm willing to accept that. So here's the finished handle wrap. You can see that knot that I tied, and then it has that final loop, and I'm pulling that through. That just kind of locks it together, and then I cut off the pigtails and tuck them into place, or rather I tuck them underneath the lashing because there's a little bit of space where that loop is underneath, and you can kind of see on that ridge line. And then the last step after this is just putting some final finishing coats on it, which I went ahead and just skipped because that's also nice and boring. And here is the finished piece. I love how this piece turned out. It is a pretty awesome piece. The bull shark teeth on both sides of the blade just turned out epic. The contrast between the Koawood and the pearl and the handle wrap, it's just an awesome piece. Let me know in the comments below what you think about it. If you liked it, if you think it's lame, if you think it's awesome. I love all the comments. If you have any suggestions, go ahead and leave that there as well. Mahalo plenty for everyone that tunes in, and I will see you on the next video. Aloha.